Welcome to Dementia Symptoms While in Paid Employment, Impact on Occupational Competence and Occupational Participation. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Projects Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program, through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Pain BC, Sport Chronic Pain Network, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow it with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Today's presenter is Catherine Andrew. Catherine Andrew is an occupational therapist teaching in the Bachelor of Occupational Therapy program at the Southern Cross University. She's also a PhD candidate at the University of Wollongong in Australia. Since graduating in 1984, she has worked across a range of clinical settings in Australia and the United States. She has specialist qualifications as a registered occupational therapy driving assessor, and in 2014 co-authored the Dementia and Driving Decision Aid. Catherine is a certified practicing ergonomist with extensive experience in workplace injury management. She's currently undertaking research with people living with dementia to identify enablers and barriers to extending workforce participation and supporting the experience of transitioning to retirement. Catherine, we're honored to have you online with us today. Thank you so much for presenting this webinar. Without further ado, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Yusra, and hello and welcome to the people that have come along to hear the presentation. How organisations and employers and other stakeholders approach the issues associated with workers who may be presenting with symptoms of a dementia can have a significant impact on positive or negative workforce participation experiences for people during their journey from role as paid worker to separation. So as Yusra mentioned, I'm currently completing my PhD on this topic, looking at the impact of dementia on workforce participation. And I became interested as an extension of my experience working as a rehab coordinator for a large organisation in Australia. Let me tell you the story. One of my jobs was to assist workers return to work for both work and non-work related disability and illness. I provided guidance about fitness for specific aspects of workers' duties and made recommendations about graded return to work using reasonable adjustments and modified work hours. It was along that journey that I heard about a situation that really moved me. There was a storeman. He'd been well liked and hardworking, but gradually over a couple of years, his commitment to his job and his level of disorganisation became so bad that he was fired. He was devastated. His family was devastated. He went on unemployment benefits and tried hard to find other jobs. Then fast forward 12 months, he was diagnosed with dementia. He is now on sickness benefits at home and being cared for by his wife full time. He was 48 years old when he was sacked. I started to ask myself questions. What could have been done differently? What if he was diagnosed earlier? What if he'd received medical retirement instead of retrenchment? So this is when I wanted to know about people's experiences of transitioning from paid worker roles to finishing up at work. How could these experiences be ameliorated, and that is, made less devastating? So the impact of dementia on workforce participation is becoming an increasingly important topic. Let me show you some reasons for this. Let's talk about the trending socioeconomic landscape. Retirement is considered a rite of passage at a nominal age in developed countries, including the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. However, people are now living well beyond retirement age. Consequently, there have been strategic shifts in government policy worldwide to increase workforce participation of older workers. So what does this mean? It means that the number of individuals presenting with signs and symptoms of a dementia while still in paid work is also likely to increase. What do we know about dementia from the literature? Well, we do know that dementia is not a natural part of ageing, although the number of people in the population with dementia will increase with age. We also know that dementia is not only a disease of older age, with approximately 3.5% of people under 65 presenting with symptoms of dementia in developed countries. Onset of symptoms are hard to define because changes are gradual and non-specific. As the disease progresses over time, symptoms gradually impact on capacity to perform activities of daily living, including paid work. We also know from the literature that expert advice regarding reasonable workplace adjustment enables employers to manage occupational risk and extend workforce participation for those with dementia. However, many employers and their representatives consider that they're not well enough equipped to both recognise symptoms of cognitive decline in the workplace and also address problems and issues when a worker is experiencing onset of a dementia. Therefore, it is important to implement organisational strategies that identify changes in a worker's functional capacity that is possibly related to dementia and seek advice regarding the provision of reasonable adjustment and also to facilitate a supported transition to retirement. Something that I believe is important, it is important to empower workforce influencers like those of us attending this presentation today in order to achieve better outcomes for workers with symptoms of dementia and the organisations for which they work for. I thought we could start today with a poll so that you can check in with how confident you are about recognising a worker's symptoms of cognitive decline in the workplace and also addressing problems and issues with a worker who's experiencing onset of a dementia. So, are you very confident, somewhat confident, or not at all? Let's see if we can shed some light on this important topic.
So, Kathy, the results read that 50% of our audience is very confident and 50% is not confident at all.
Ah, that's for recognising and for addressing symptoms.
I will launch the addressing one right now. All right, and the results for how confident our audience is about addressing problems and issues with a worker who is experiencing onset of a dementia is 33% very confident, 33% somewhat confident, and 33% not confident at all.
Oh, that's great information. So this is reflective of what we've seen in the literature about the level of confidence. Some people are and some people aren't, and hopefully we'll be able to work together and come up with some ways to influence people in the workplace to bring about more confidence and better outcomes for both the organisations and for the workers. So in the next part of this presentation, we'll explore topics about the impact of dementia on salient workforce participation issues, and we'll draw on lessons I've learnt from existing literature, as well as from my interviews with Australians who've experienced onset of dementia symptoms whilst in paid work. We'll define who is the older worker and discuss how physiological changes associated with getting older are different to dementia symptoms. We will explore what is dementia and why are symptoms difficult to diagnose. We will determine how dementia impacts on workforce participation prior to diagnosis, during diagnosis, and after diagnosis. We will explore policy and practice strategies that can be applied to inform more favourable outcomes for both workers and the organisations they are employed by. So who is the older worker? We don't have a poll for this one, but just take a moment to think about at what age would you consider a person an older worker? Would you consider somebody over 70 an older worker, or over 60 perhaps? What about over 45? The term older worker is very subjective. We know that there is no longer a mandatory retirement age in most sectors of the US labour force. This policy change is similar to other countries, including Canada, the UK, New Zealand and Australia. Exemptions occur for those jobs where age-related changes in function, that is, ability to competently fulfil inherent requirements of the job, may impact on public safety. Examples include air traffic controllers who require complex cognitive functional abilities or firefighters who need high levels of physical fitness. These workers are not permitted to work beyond the age of 58 years. Subsequent to the withdrawal of the mandatory retirement ages for the majority of workers, the age at which a person becomes eligible for the aged pension is increasing in many countries. For example, by 2023, the retirement age will increase to 67 years in the US and Australia, and 68 years by 2028 for Irish workers. Further, workers in the US, Canada, Australia and the UK are now being offered financial incentives to delay their retirement and work beyond the age of pension eligibility. So one important thing to think about is there is no consistent definition within the international literature to describe the age at which someone is deemed an older worker. Interestingly, in the US, an older worker is specifically defined as aged 40 years or over for the purposes of the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. An older worker in Australia is defined by the Australian Bureau of Statistics as 45 years or older. However, there is international consensus that suggests that an older worker is either the person aged over 55 years or someone nearing eligibility age for retirement. Now, this becomes important for us to consider because as the age of retirement is extended by either personal choice, economic necessity or legislation, it will become critically important to ensure that work demands are matched to the functional ability of older workers who will be remaining in the workforce longer, and workers who would otherwise have retired may be forced to stay at work regardless of changes in capacity that might have otherwise preempted a diagnosis of dementia and cessation from work. It is well documented in the literature that the natural process of aging impacts on physical functioning. A person may experience changes in muscle strength and range of motion, cardiovascular and respiratory fitness decreases, balance, sleep patterns and heat regulation changes occur. Visual and hearing acuity also diminish. Again, who is the older worker? We're not talking about somebody who is over 70. We're talking about perhaps somebody who's 45, 55, 65. In addition to physical changes, it is also recognised that cognitive function gradually declines with age. While verbal tasks and vocabulary remain constant or improve, tasks that depend on short-term memory usually take longer. So thinking about this, I can quite comfortably fit into the category of older worker. Therefore, I have to think, do I have problems with my short-term memory and things taking longer? And I'm not somebody with dementia, but it could just be part of the natural process of aging. Older workers tend to rely on their experience and expertise when working and therefore may find it hard to work with complex or confusing stimuli. It might be more stressful to do tasks that require multitasking. It may be more tricky to work in a busy environment where many things are going on and learning new processes can be more challenging. We may be able to think about colleagues who have excellent corporate knowledge and know what to do and when to do it. However, the person may report that reliance on new and improved computer-based systems is making work increasingly less enjoyable. For some of us, these will be part of the normal changes we face as a natural process of becoming an older worker. But this is not dementia, right? Whilst a range of cognitive changes are considered a normal feature of the ageing process, more critical for consideration with the increase in retirement age is the likelihood that a subset of older working population people will develop symptoms of a dementia. Let me share you a story about Megan. 60-year-old Megan was finding work more challenging, and things that used to be easy were becoming more frustrated. There were things about work that were enjoyable, like the sociable aspects of meeting up at morning tea and lunch, but things like meeting targets and deadlines, keeping up with the computer side of things, that was getting harder. It was time to take leave and semi-retire, maybe start a small part-time business or work as a seasonal fruit picker and travel. However, not long after retiring, a zero-speed traffic accident in the local shopping centre car park became the crisis that led to medical investigation and eventually a diagnosis of dementia. In hindsight, this diagnosis explained those niggling things that were making work more difficult. So you can see there may be initially an overlap between what we consider normal features of ageing and the yet to be identified symptoms of dementia. So what is dementia? Dementia is an umbrella term used to describe a set of symptoms of cognitive decline that gradually impact on memory, thought processing, and capacity to perform routine activities of daily living. There are many types of dementia, but the three most common are Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, and Lewy body dementia. Lewy body dementia initially presents as Parkinson's disease, but unlike Parkinson's, it leads on to dementia symptoms that are particularly unique and create problems for the person in terms of becoming quite paranoid and worried about what's going on around them. Again, all of these symptoms are gradual and progressive, so they don't just happen overnight. Dementia is not only a disease that affects older people. Let's have a look at the statistics. Approximately 1 in every 1,000 people, or 3.4% of the US population under the age of 65, have some form of dementia. These statistics are similar to those in other developed countries. We also know that prevalence increases to 6% for those in the 65 to 69 years age bracket, and then 10% for 70 to 74 years. So we can see that if we're looking at encouraging people to remain in the workforce for longer, then we are going to have to acknowledge that a proportion of the workforce, even though it might be small, are going to present with problems of undiagnosed dementia. In contrast to changes in functional capacity associated with normal aging, onset and progression of symptoms of dementia are more specific, and a worker may present with a range of deficits, such as problems with short-term memory, planning, judgment, and executive function, and problems with orientation to time and place. And also, an interesting one is recognising people or objects. A gentleman once told me that he first realised he had signs of dementia when he could recognise people in the context of the work setting that he worked with every day, but then when they bumped into him in the supermarket on the weekends, he had no idea who they were. This can be a feature of dementia. The time of onset can be hard to define, and obtaining a timely diagnosis can be problematic because symptoms are often misattributed to other factors such as stress or substance abuse, or the situation might even be considered a normal part of aging. People, including the doctors who may get asked to get involved, do not expect that symptoms could possibly be related to dementia. Let me share with you another story. This is about Karen, who was 47 when she was diagnosed with dementia. Karen explained to me, I had been the area manager in charge of staff, budgets and portfolios. And so when some of the things that were changing for me, like some of the strange memory loss, not just short-term but long-term, and this dyslexia thing, suddenly I couldn't spell that and was seeing numbers back to front. I didn't for 1 second expect to be told after 2 years of testing it was dementia. So during this period, Karen continued to manage at work as best she could. She worked out strategies to avoid mistakes. She carried notebooks to meetings, something she'd never done before. She asked a colleague to confidentially double check her work before sending out accounts. She was working in a low-risk occupation and her work was mainly office-based, but at times it included interstate driving, where she was expected to drive in the country and also long distances alone to catch up with customers and provide in-services and customer service. So it is important to note that the impact of dementia on capacity to carry out complex work tasks differs between individuals. This is due to the type and progression of the disease and variations in physical, cognitive, and psychosocial demands across occupations. If dementia is the health condition and we categorise the activities the person performs as low, medium, or high risk based on whether they can perform safely, this will depend on personal factors such as extent of cognitive symptoms or other comorbidities, and also environmental factors, the type of environment they are expected to perform their work in. In Karen's case, when she finally did receive a diagnosis of dementia and inform her employer, there should be consultation. Whilst capacity to continue most of her usual tasks might be okay, should she be driving long distances now, alone, interstate? Perhaps she was safe or perhaps she was not, but there was no discussion and her story is not unique. Therefore, to manage the impact of dementia on workforce participation for those with dementia, targeted workplace policies and practices must be implemented. We need to understand ways to identify and appropriately address potential onset and progression of symptoms in the workplace. So onset of dementia is hard to define, and symptoms progressively impact on memory, thought processing, and capacity to perform routine activities. One way that we can actually understand dementia is to consider the three phases that were described by Steeman and colleagues in terms of progression. There's usually the pre-diagnosis phase, the diagnosis, and then the post-diagnosis phases. The workplace is often where changes in functional capacity to perform familiar work routines are first noticed. This triggers a crisis that becomes a catalyst for either seeking diagnosis or terminating poorly performing workers who are later medically diagnosed with dementia. During the pre-diagnostic phase, there may be an initial reluctance to acknowledge dementia symptoms, and in hindsight, they may be recognised as part of the disease. Even before formal diagnosis is sought, workers become increasingly aware of decline in ability to manage tasks and maintain concentration, and they also report difficulties with word finding, writing, remembering names, and adjusting to change. Undiagnosed changes can result in co-workers covertly covering mistakes of their peers or employers surreptitiously initiating surveillance. During this pre-diagnosis phase, there is a potential for misdiagnosis. We might attribute changes in work behaviours, poor quality work, lack of initiative, and work absences to things such as mental health problems or substance abuse or family breakups. Typical changes reported by co-workers and employers include people demonstrating a lack of motivation, making critical mistakes, showing difficulty performing usual routines, and inability to learn new routines as quickly as their peers. Employers describe previously capable workers as becoming forgetful and slow in completing habituated tasks. As undiagnosed symptoms progress, some employer responses to managing changes in work performance lead to performance management and dismissal. This is what happened to Ross, who was 52 and had worked in the same industry since he was 17. Ross explained, "I got called to a meeting with the management team. It was the first of 3 performance management meetings over the next 6 months. How could someone like me who loved work and had such a great reputation now be struggling to meet the deliverables? The boss put it down to stress, non-work related of course. I was banned from working those extra long hours that helped me keep up to date. It got down to the last and final warning. Then one afternoon, I lost the work car after parking it in a familiar location. I was doing a site visit. It was very scary. I was very late back to the office. Let's pause for a moment. What if Ross was in your organisation and you were the boss? What assumptions might you have made as to the cause of the changes in Ross's work behaviour? How might you have addressed these changes? How these situations are addressed can have significant and far-reaching implications for everyone involved. We've got a poll here, so why don't you just take a moment to answer these questions and we'll get some feedback from Yusra.
And the first result for the first part of the question is 100% of our audience think that it might be a medical reason, such as brain tumor or dementia.
Okay, yep.
I'll go ahead and launch the second part of the poll. So half of our audience would have addressed it that way, so raise concerns with Ross and initiate medical investigation, or and the other half would make contact with Ross's wife to express concerns.
Okay, that's great. So you can see that I can't, I wonder why the employer didn't think of these things. So in our audience, myself, we would have started to look at, well, what else was going on here? But they didn't do that. They just made an assumption. And speaking to Ross and his wife, they thought it was because really they wanted to downsize. Ross had been in the same company, but the company had changed ownership over those years. And if you weren't performing, it was time to get out. The interesting thing I can tell you is that raising concerns with Ross and initiating medical investigation was something that would be important, and also perhaps making contact with Ross's wife, because at the time she didn't really have any idea of what was going on at home at work with Ross and his employment situation. She thought there might have been a few problems, but not knowing what it was. And he wasn't presenting at home with symptoms of dementia or symptoms of other things. But when he did get his final warning, let's see what happened. I'll just continue with that. I'll tell you what happened. So the workplace is often where difficulty coping at work can become a catalyst for seeking a medical diagnosis to explain changes in performance. It's worth keeping in mind that the employer, the HR representatives, the OH nurse, or in my role as the part of the work health and safety team, we can be instrumental in initiating timely medical investigation. In Ross's case, as I said, his wife knew he was having some problems with management, but didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. Here's what happened next. So after the final warning, I knew something was not right. I did not go back to work. I took sick leave. I was just naughty and I wasn't getting the work done. A friend of a friend fast-tracked an appointment with a neuro specialist, and after a series of tests, I was diagnosed with probable dementia. It was not the diagnosis I expected. The attitude of the HR person changed immediately. There was genuine concern. She helped me file for medical retirement. And even if they'd offered for me to stay with support, I couldn't go back. By then, I was a wreck. At least with medical retirement, financially, we could survive. So Ross really wanted to share his story and raise community awareness about how unexplained changes in performance at work can be managed more effectively by the employer. You see from this outcome, Ross was able to medically retire, a much better outcome than being sacked. But we can also see how close he came to walking down a less favourable path, because the way his unexplained symptoms were addressed by management without considering a medical diagnosis. It was his wife that was very supportive. She was also surprised during this process that the management hadn't contacted her or hadn't invited a third person to come and support Ross at the meetings. It was just all done in quite a formal way that had no consideration of what could have been done differently. So what happens when someone obtains a diagnosis? There's this aha moment for the worker and also for those around them, a sense of, well, that explains everything. With diagnosis comes a sense of relief when reasons behind changes in capacity to maintain worker roles are understood. For colleagues and employers, diagnosis offers an acceptable explanation for observed behaviour changes. We can see from the story of Ross that attitudes in the workplace changed for the better. For those with positive experiences, the impact of dementia on the transition from work to retirement was influenced by opportunities to discuss extending work for as long as possible with reasonable adjustment and plans for the timing of retirement. Unfortunately, for some workers, employers advocate for early or medical retirement without considering preferences of their worker. They are making assumptions that a worker's time would be better spent at home, engaging in domestic and leisure roles. This role may be considered supportive by employers, despite evidence that workers may prefer to continue for working as long as possible. I would like to share with you two very different scenarios about the transition following a diagnosis of dementia. The first is Karen's experience, and the second is Pete's story. There are lessons to be learnt from both of those. Firstly, let's find out what happened to Karen, the 47-year-old area manager. After I was diagnosed, nothing really changed until I lost my driver's license. I was asked to leave, terminated. No medical retirement, no farewell. And it was obvious I could still be doing a telephone sales position. I was doing the regional sales manager job and obviously needed to drive. Had I realised my doctors or Alzheimer's told me about my disability rights, I should never have been asked to leave. So what happened to Karen? Should she have left? Was she ready to leave? I can tell you that Karen is now a very strong voice, lobbying internationally for the rights of people with dementia. She certainly could have done the telephone sales job. Now, why don't we compare her story to what happened in Pete's story? He was working in sales. His territory covered the whole state. I told my employer once I was diagnosed. I was offered reasonable adjustment and reduced hours. The company was extremely supportive. When the time came to medically retire, there was a big send-off. Well, I can tell you that there was a really big send-off after Pete left. He stayed working for 18 months after diagnosis with the help of his boss, his customers and his work colleagues. He gradually reduced his hours and days of work. He used a GPS and employed some interesting strategies to get the job done. Now he's also raising awareness in the press about dementia, working, and he's also aiming to change stereotypical attitudes about what happens to young people when they're working and they get dementia. So what are the key enablers to supporting a worker diagnosed with dementia? One key enabler for supporting a worker is to initiate important conversations with the worker and the employer and understand what their preferences are about staying at work or ceasing. It is important that employees are given the opportunity to share a diagnosis with their employer without fear of dismissal. There's one story about a lady who received her diagnosis and made a conscious decision not to share that with her employer. So she was working in a counselling role. Think about that if she was working in a role that involved operating complex machinery or making decisions that impacted on other people. It would have been far better for her to feel comfortable about sharing her story with her employer in order to protect her and her co-workers and also the business that she was working for. Key enablers for supporting people are also engaging stakeholders early, including health professionals, HR, OH&S and others to inform decisions about staying at work or ceasing. This enables informed discussion about whether to stay at work for as long as possible and also allows access to medical retirement, access to reasonable adjustment and things like that. And it's interesting that even if somebody gets a diagnosis and decides that actually, you know what, I want to retire, I don't want to stay at work, if they're involved in that decision making and the choice and the discussion, they feel much better about the decisions that were made. They feel that they were part of that and they were in control. And this actually has a good impact on workers' relationships and the relationships between the employer and their colleagues, particularly moving forward. Another key enabler for supporting a worker diagnosed with dementia is seeking expert advice regarding reasonable adjustments recommended to continue safe and productive workforce participation. So people living with dementia, we know, can extend their paid worker role with access to reasonable adjustment, including modification of hours and duties. But how is this supposed to be conducted? So we may not have the expertise within our organisation to determine what's safe, what's not safe, what strategies can we implement. But there are many experts out there who are happy to come in and support the worker to return to work. In Australia, we have a particular organisation that works with employees that have job in jeopardy, and they will send out an occupational therapist to assess the workplace and make recommendations. And if there's any particular adjustments that need to be made, they will also contribute financially to put those in place. So let's have a look at a rhetorical question again. What do you see as the main barrier to providing reasonable adjustment in your workplace? Now this is interesting. For those that have tuned into last week's webinar, it was about reasonable adjustment. We all make reasonable adjustments for our workers, and not just for people with disabilities. We make reasonable adjustments for people with parenting responsibilities. We might make reasonable adjustments for people who are aging or who are caring for somebody with a disability. We make adjustments for people with disabilities. So what would you see as the main barrier in your place? The literature that did the research on this talked about not having access to expert advice. So that is something that we can tap into. We can have conversations with the doctor, with the rehab provider, the OH&S nurse, and look at ways that we can match a person's functional capabilities with the work that they're doing or they need to do. Key enablers for supporting a worker diagnosed with dementia include staging the transition from a full-time role as symptoms progress. So we know that dementia is progressive, and we don't know at what pace they progress, but we do know that things can be done to support that full-time to part-time role. One of the things is that we can look at how we can actually support that process of ceasing work. So in Karen's case, she just left work. That was it. She was told on the Friday afternoon, okay, if you can't drive, you haven't got your license, you better pack up your bags and go. And on Friday afternoon, that's exactly what she did. She didn't say farewell to her colleagues or her friends. She just was asked to leave. So she packed up her bag. She told me she didn't feel like she'd been farewelled, and she didn't feel like she'd been let go like anything else before. She actually felt kind of sacked, but she felt that it was her fault and felt a lot of shame because she had dementia. So one of the important things to consider is when the time comes to cease work, it's important to think about providing opportunity for the worker to accept recognition of a job well done and say goodbye to colleagues, or if it's their preference, to leave quietly. Now what I'm going to do is let's just take a moment to revisit Karen's story. Imagine we have a chance to rewrite it. So we've got Karen's story up there on the screen, and I've highlighted some of the things that perhaps we could have done differently in hindsight. We cannot turn back the hands of time for Karen and her employer to manage the outcomes better, but we can take these lessons and improve outcomes for others into the future. Karen and others with similar journeys would really appreciate this. What if, after diagnosis and disclosing to her employer about her diagnosis, Karen met with her manager and explained the situation? What if the employer sought advice about her medical situation and how best to manage Karen's changes in capacity to do the various jobs safely over time? What if, once the employer became aware that symptoms would progress and knew from discussion with Karen that she was keen to remain at work for as long as possible, what if they'd sought help to match and rematch work tasks with Karen's abilities? What if reasonable adjustments were put in place and reviewed regularly? Capacity for long-term driving would have been monitored by Karen's medical team, and perhaps the occupational therapist would have done an assessment early to determine her fitness to drive and make recommendations about where she could drive and when she could drive safely for work. What about if some of her colleagues were advised of the potential need for support with her by giving her reminders and checking invoices before they were sent out? Once they had an expectation for the changes they were observing, once they had an explanation for the changes they were observing, the once happy, organised Karen would have been someone they were very happy to help. So what if Karen felt very relieved and supported, knowing that she was able to stay at work? Without the shame and the stress, she would have noticed that she was making less errors anyway and was able to do her job possibly for longer. What about if when Karen was scheduled for a driving test, the manager was aware of the possibility that she may lose her licence? What if they discussed the next step? When Karen lost her licence, of course she was devastated. But what if her employer and her discussed the medical retirement at this point? What if it was, rather than just being told it was time to leave? What if it was decided that Karen could stay on doing the contacts with existing customers by telephone, or working 3 days per week, 5 hours per day? What if she could keep in touch with her clients and assist with the transition of the new person who would be taking over her job, who would be doing the travelling and the face-to-face meetings interstate? This would allow Karen, over time, the ability to deal with the cognitive demands of work as they became more obvious, and she and her medical team could decide it was time to leave work. Karen could then discuss this with the manager, and together they could make a plan. She would gradually reduce her hours, and by the new year, she would finish up. HR would help her and her manager start the process of medical retirement. When the day came to leave, Karen would be given an afternoon tea and be able to say goodbye to her colleagues. She would miss their companionship, but they understood it was time and that it was time for her to leave. So that could have been Karen's story. Can I just tell you that Karen is currently doing her PhD. It's been more than 4 years since she was asked to leave work, and she's working furiously as an advocate for those with dementia. She certainly could have continued on with reasonable adjustment at work for an extended period of time. And she certainly would have been eligible for medical retirement rather than just being told to leave. One of the lucky things for Karen, and she talks about this, is when she did leave work, she'd also already had her own personal injury insurance. So whilst others in her situation may have had to go on unemployment benefits, she was able to access those and remain in a stable financial position. But this is often not the case with people who are let go without proper support or access to appropriate medical retirement. So I just want to do just want to quickly look at the recommendations here. We need to adopt workplace initiatives to increase awareness about the impact of early symptoms of unexplained decline in work performance. We need to provide opportunities to support workers as they transition to retirement to encourage disclosure without fear of termination. We need access to suitably qualified experts to assist with determining the extent to which changes in functional capacity may or may not impact on an individual's capacity to undertake critical work demands. And we need to support worker decline in functional capacity through provision of reasonable adjustment in line with disability discrimination and other laws, including age discrimination. So before we conclude, let's just go back to our initial poll. And I just want to ask you now, how much has your confidence level changed about recognising a worker's symptoms of cognitive decline and addressing the issues in the workplace? For those of you who felt very confident, I would expect no significant change, but interested to see how people are feeling now.
It looks like the people who are not confident at all have shifted to somewhat confident, and there's no change for people who are very confident?
So I can just say that for those of you who have shifted from not at all to somewhat, it's just so important that I think that we access ways to raise awareness about the fact that it could be dementia. And also, we don't even have to know whether or not it's dementia. It's initiating that conversation that perhaps something's not right. In Australia, we have this thing called "Are You OK" Day, and it's where we say to somebody, "Are you okay? Is everything okay? What's going on?" And it's basically been set up so that we can encourage colleagues and staff, colleagues and their managers to start to ask those questions, the questions that we might think are rude or we shouldn't really intrude on those things, but it's definitely worth giving yourself permission to ask the questions, even if you're not confident that it's cognitive decline or that it may be something else. So avoid making assumptions.
All right, and the last question for the answers of the last question. So 50% are very confident and 50% are somewhat confident.
Okay, well, thank you, Yusra. Thanks for everyone for responding. And again, for those of you that have moved from not at all confident to somewhat confident in addressing the problems, remember that you're not alone and you don't have to have all the answers. Simply by asking somebody in HR or getting involved with OH&S and finding out what could be going on is very important. It reminds me of a story where a gentleman with what we thought was Parkinson's disease was performing very poorly, and before they went and started this process of performance managing him, the executive called me into the office and said, "Look, I'm just wanting to check, could there be something else going on? How can we find out about that?" And it wasn't my role to actually determine what was going on, but it was my role to facilitate the necessary inquiries into medical situations that could facilitate investigating what was really going on. And interesting for that particular gentleman, years later, I find out that it wasn't just Parkinson's he had, it was Lewy body dementia, and that would have been contributing to some of the workforce behaviours that we were watching. So, conclusion. Work health and safety implications for onset of cognitive decline associated with policy and practice strategies to extend workforce participation for older workers need to be addressed. Increased awareness of how changes in work performance may be related to symptoms of an undiagnosed dementia or other types of cognitive decline is needed in order to support workers, co-workers and employers. Workplace policy and practices that align with workers' rights and employers' responsibilities for reasonable adjustment and medical retirement is required to support those presenting with symptoms of a dementia. And Yusra, that's my presentation. I've got some references attached to the PowerPoint, but we've got time for questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for this wonderful presentation. I'll go ahead and start the Q&A session. And the first question is, are there any professions that are more adapted than others for people with dementia?
More adapted, let's assume that question means, are there any organisations that are more adaptive and more responsive to identifying and supporting someone with dementia? It's interesting from my experience that we'd have to say the answer is no, because it's more about the attitude of the employer. It's not the size of the employer. It's not the background of the employer. It's not whether it's if you might think that if somebody's in healthcare, there might be more expectation that they would recognise changes were related to cognitive decline rather than to performance issues, but that's not the case. And also, you know, in the terms of, so we had a situation where in Karen's case, she was working for a large multinational company who certainly had room to access information and also to offer reasonable adjustment and medical retirement. But that didn't happen. Whereas the other person, Pete, he was working for a national company, a smaller family-run business, and they were just so good to him and so supportive that, and there was no reason for that no different reason for that, except that they just came from a different mindset and took the opportunity to support him in any way they could.
Thank you so much for answering, Catherine. The second question is, what are the possible work outcomes for an employee who discloses an early stage of dementia?
Okay, so it can either be that they're supported, or that they're terminated, or that they are put on sick leave, and then once that's extinguished, they can be put on medical retirement. So again, it's about how is it approached in the workplace by individual worker organisations. So if someone does disclose, they can end up being terminated, hopefully with acknowledgement. Like in Australia, they should be medically retired.
Thank you so much for answering, Catherine. The third question is, are you aware of cases when adjustments were made to accommodate an employee living with dementia? How helpful was it, and how long can we prolong it to the stay at work?
So that's a good question. How long can we, what adjustments and how long can we prolong it? This gets back to one of my earlier slides, that dementia symptoms progress at different rates for different people. So that's important. And also the type of work that people are doing. So if somebody is an airline pilot and they've been given a diagnosis of dementia, then they shouldn't be driving. If somebody is doing, flying, if somebody is working in administration, they can be supported. Some of the ways to do that is to just do double checking perhaps, or to have a peer support. I'll tell you the story about Pete. I did say that he had some interesting strategies. So his employer was very supportive. Pete went and got an assistance dog. And this assistance dog, he took to work, he took on flights, he took everywhere. The assistance dog would help him find his keys, find all his stuff he needed when he was traveling. The other thing that he was able to access was, as I said, using his GPS. But every morning his co-worker would ring him and say, have you got organised? Here's your following appointments, and they'd pop up in his diary. Other things that have worked have just been looking at, well, what's the best time of day to work? For some people, the best time of day is in the morning. So the people will come into work for 4 or 5 hours a day every morning, and not in the afternoon. The most important thing to think about is, what can somebody do now, and how can we support them? And then how can we work towards what's going to happen in the future as they decline? And occupational therapists are very good at looking at job matches with person's abilities, and coming up with suitable duties for now and in the future.
Makes sense. Thank you, Catherine. Next question is, what are the red flags that an employer should look for in the behavior of a person with dementia despite work adjustments? When is the appropriate time to end employment to prevent any type of endangerment to the employee, their colleagues, and the organization? And the second part of the same question is, what type of compensation is recommended legally or according to good practice?
Okay, so for the first part of the question, again, I'll say it's on a case-by-case basis. So depending on the type of occupation the person is doing, or the parts of the work that can be, I suppose, adjusted or narrowed down so the person and everybody is safe. If it gets to the point where the person cannot do work with reasonable adjustment safely, and it's deemed that way, then it's best to have that conversation and prepare the worker for the fact that it might be time to retire. And quite often by that stage, the person who's been supported will be ready to retire. Another interesting part of that is always making sure that people have somewhere else to go in terms of what are they going to do when they do retire. So sometimes facilitating that conversation can be useful as well. Now, about medical retirement, can you just read that question again for me? The second part?
So what type of compensation is recommended legally or according to good practices?
Okay. So I would have to speak specifically in relation to Australia, but I'm sure that in other countries, and I've looked at the literature, it talks about access to insurance, access to medical retirement. It's very important that we look at what is available for the person who is going to have to eventually separate from work, and wherever possible, go with the medical retirement. Interesting on that one, when I was doing my work as a in work health and safety team, I wouldn't suggest somebody reduces their hours, their full, what do we call it? Don't reduce your permanent hours on paper from full-time to part-time. Reduce the hours by going on sick leave or unpaid leave, so that when the time comes to separate from work, you're actually looking at what your substantive position is that you're seeking medical retirement or insurance for, because that will have a big difference to the amount of money that's paid out.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Another question is, the process you have presented is assuming general type of carriers. What if the employee is a contract worker or high achiever? So this person says that I am sure the pattern is different. Also, the age of retirement for baby boomers is different from those that are now in the work market. So the age of old workers can change too.
Okay, so the first part of the question is it different for contractors?
Yeah,
So this,
contract workers or high achievers.
high achievers, meaning people that want to stay at work.
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, it can, people that, yeah. So you need to consider, again, as a case-by-case basis. So contractors shouldn't be on site if they're not safe, but how they're supported, and if they should, they probably, if they're not, if they're hired workers, then they probably really need to look at, are they safe to be there? And it's depending on the contractual arrangement. But if they're, this is where you'd look at if somebody is on, what do you mean by I'm sorry, what do you mean by contracted in your country? Does that mean that they're only on short term, or they're coming in as an independent worker?
I'm receiving some precisions regarding this question. So high achievers meaning surgeon, PhD clinician, and
Yes.
contract worker, contract to do medical legal work, for example.
Yep. So we need, again, a case-by-case basis. So if somebody is doing those critical demands, then it would be, I would be looking at what are their capabilities, what's required in the job, and what's the risks involved. So we're looking at, for those high-risk occupations, then it's definitely being more conservative about whether or not to keep people at work and to support them in early decisions about medical retirement. It's just not appropriate that somebody that is doing critical tasks that continue if they're not capable. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And the last question is, can you give examples of work adjustments that can be made at work for people living with dementia? Concrete examples.
Concrete examples. Okay. So changing the hours, looking at keeping somebody in a more quiet space, looking at what jobs they're doing and making sure that they are routine jobs, habits, not things that require new learning. Is it computer-based? What about messaging, reminders, using technology, things like that? Buddy systems have worked, and it depends on what sort of work people are doing. So I'm sorry that I'm not answering this clearly enough. But again, I would say if you had a situation where you had the worker and the employer wanted to support that worker, looking at the occupational therapist coming out and looking at matching that job up, they would come up with specific tasks that would suit that worker, same as they would for offering any other reasonable adjustments.
Makes sense.
Demos, all sorts of things. Yeah.
Would you say that working from home, would you say that it would be helpful or not recommended? What do you think?
Working from home would not necessarily be helpful, but you're looking at flexibility. Okay, so what flexibility are you offering to your employee? and depending on what they're doing. So if it involved a lot of driving to get to work, then sometimes working from home might be appropriate, but not always.
Mhm. Well,
If,
thank you so much, Catherine.
Hello.
Sorry, did you have anything to add before the end of our webinar?
No, thanks for all the curly questions.
Yeah, so
If I
many.
had more time, I would certainly be happy to talk about it. Or if people want to send me the questions or email me or anything like that, I'm happy to share some of the literature around those things.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you for sharing your valuable knowledge on dementia and paid employment, as well as accommodations or work adjustments, and just ways to support the transition to medical retirement. We truly appreciate your presence and the time you took to put this presentation together. So thank you so much, Catherine. And to our audience, thank you for your support and participation.